Revolutions are fascinating moments of history. They have been occurring over some 500 years and they still keep occurring. From revolutions we can learn a lot about past societies and their concerns. But we can also learn about political crises in general and about human behavior in such crises. The Netherlands have a particular place in the story of revolutions. It can be argued that the revolt of the 1560s and 70s was the first revolution, at least in European and Western history. It was also what we could call a successful revolution, as it led to the liberation of the Northern Netherlands from Spanish rule and to the foundation of a pluralistic and, at least by the standards of the time, a relatively liberal society. Later on there were two revolutions in England during the 17th century and then of course the famous American and French revolutions of the 18th century. They all had in common the resistance against a king who was seen to be too authoritarian and who was therefore accused of violating established rights. What they also all had in common was the existence of some kind of representative assembly, parliament or otherwise estates general. A representative assembly that could coordinate the resistance and that could then take over political power from the king. If we make a comparison at this point with the revolutions of the so-called Arab Spring that started some 5 years ago, we could say that such representative institutions did not exist here, or to the extent that they did exist, they were just instruments of the autocratic rulers of those states. So they were not able to organize the resistance and then to take over power from the rulers. This is probably a major reason why the Arab revolutions seem to have failed, with the exception of Tunisia. Now, if we look back into the history of revolutions again, we must be careful not to think that they all had the same aims, or indeed that they all had or have the aim of creating democracy. That is actually a relatively modern phenomenon. Until the American and the French revolutions, the idea of democracy didn't really exist yet. Even in those revolutions, the creation of democracy was not their intention, but only their outcome that nobody had really foreseen. After the American and French revolutions, however, so in the 19th and 20th centuries, the creation of democracy was an intention of many revolutionaries. But it was and still is never the intention of all revolutionaries or of all people who are involved in revolutions. There was and is never such a thing as the people as a whole who want something. Different people and different groups of people always want different things, and sometimes very different things. Otherwise, we wouldn't need elections or political parties, we wouldn't even need democracy. Again, this is clearly evident in the Arab Spring. Some people certainly wanted democracy, but others just demanded better living conditions, and yet others wanted a more religious Islamic society. In the Arab Spring, and really in all revolutions, we can see that a revolution can be successful in the beginning when everyone agrees what they don't like, such as a king or a ruler. But what exactly should happen then, who should then rule and how, is an entirely different question, and one that usually most people disagree about. That was already the case in the French Revolution, that therefore also resulted in turmoil and violence. But the French and American revolutions provided also a model to deal with such situations, namely to create a constituent assembly that should once and for all decide what the future of a society and government should look like. This, however, is very difficult and takes a lot of time and patience, and again in the Arab Spring worked out only in Tunisia. The history of revolutions thus shows us two things. It has been, and still is, possible to stand up successfully against a political evil such a dictatorship. But it also shows us that it is very difficult and often turns out to be impossible to establish a new political order.